In this courtroom, we don't need toy soldiers, the defense attorney scoffed, nodding toward the Royal Guard's uniform. The gallery laughed. Even the judge smiled. But the Coldstream Guard at the witness stand didn't blink, not even once, because beneath the ribbon tucked in his cap was a truth no one in that room was ready to hear. So before we look further how justice served, comment, salute, and let us know where you're watching from. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. The defense attorney circled the witness box like a stage actor chasing his cue, his voice sharpened not by truth, but by performance. In this courtroom, he said with theatrical disdain, we don't need toy soldiers. His gaze slid toward the man in uniform, Coldstream red, brass buttons gleaming, posture exact. We need men who understand reality, not props from a parade. A ripple of laughter fluttered through the gallery. Even the judge let out a dry chuckle, adjusting his robe with a casualness that said he didn't expect much from the next few minutes. But the man at the stand, Royal Guard Thomas Monroe, didn't blink. He didn't lower his eyes, didn't flex his jaw. He simply remained, upright, unwavering, composed beneath centuries of ceremonial weight and personal silence. That uniform he wore had stood at Windsor, at the Tower, outside the palace gates. But today it stood alone in a courtroom where truth was measured in words, not watchfulness. Leeds, the attorney, smirked and tilted his head as if inspecting a museum statue. Tell me, Mr. Monroe, do you have any experience outside of saluting tourists and rehearsing stillness? The jurors glanced sideways, unsure whether to smile or shrink back. One leaned into another and whispered, "Is he allowed to speak?" But Thomas didn't move. Not from defiance, from discipline, the kind built in mud and heat and memory. His gloved hands rested calmly atop the railing. The tips of his boots touched together in ceremonial precision. Yet, just beneath the collar of his tunic, a thin scar traced along his jaw, old, healed, and barely visible unless you were really looking. No one in the room noticed, but the silence around him began to stretch, just enough to change the air. Because this man was not royal furniture. He was not a parade prop. And before this hearing ended, every person seated in that courtroom would learn. He didn't even flinch, and that said everything. Thomas Monroe had learned how to be still long before he stood watch at Buckingham Palace or walked in formation across the stone courts of Windsor. His stillness wasn't ceremonial. It was survival. It began at 9 years old when 2 uniformed strangers knocked on a foster carer's door and handed him the folded flag from his father's coffin. His mother had gone first. Illness. His father, a British Army medic, had died 6 months later in a mortar blast in Basra. From that day forward, silence became Thomas's first language. The military didn't just raise him, it rebuilt him. At Sandhurst he learned posture. In Helmand Province he learned pain. In the mountain valleys of Bosnia, during a peacekeeping operation no one in Parliament mentioned twice, he learned how to carry weight without complaint. His Coldstream Guard uniform was not pageantry, it was promise. Every brass button had meaning. Every crease was a vow not to forget the faces of those who didn't come home. By the time he accepted the ceremonial post, Thomas was 36. He had served 15 years across 3 continents. But it wasn't the rifle or the changing of the guard that mattered to him. It was what it meant to stand still when others no longer could. That was military honor in civilian life. That was service you didn't shout about. That was truth spoken with restraint. Across the courtroom floor, Daniel Leeds saw none of that. A polished product of Oxford and ego, Leeds treated every proceeding like a stage. And in this trial, the witness in red wasn't a man with history. He was a prop to be ridiculed. Leeds had made a career of it, mocking backgrounds that didn't mirror his own, discrediting uniformed testimony, dismissing anything that didn't wear a title. To him, truth was shaped by accent and attitude. To Thomas, truth was carried in silence until it needed to be placed gently and precisely, like a folded flag. As Leeds paced, painting Thomas as a pageant soldier, he launched into a monologue about his grandfather's service in real wars, slamming his hand on the bench for theatrical emphasis. What he didn't see, what no one in that courtroom yet understood, was that 5 feet away stood a man who had knelt beside brothers in the sand, who had dug trenches with blistered hands, who had once whispered a final prayer beside a body no one else had the courage to carry. Thomas did not speak, but his silence, shaped by memory and honor, was louder than Leeds would ever be. He didn't even flinch, and that said everything. Daniel Leeds stepped closer, eyes gleaming with courtroom confidence, voice raised just enough to stir the room. "Tell me, Mr. Monroe," he said with mock politeness, gesturing theatrically toward the Coldstream Guards uniform, "are you even trained for civilian courts, or just trained to freeze in place like a wax figure at Buckingham Palace?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery. The judge, half-focused, smirked faintly. Jurors exchanged glances. The air thickened, not with respect, but dismissal. Thomas Monroe stood motionless on the witness stand. Red tunic, white gloves, bearskin cap resting beside him by order of the court. And yet, even without it, he was unmistakably royal guard. Spine straight, eyes forward, presence heavy with a silence that didn't seek attention, but commanded it. That courtroom had seen rehearsed arguments, clever objections, emotional appeals. But it had never seen a man like him. Leeds wasn't finished. This case involves complex civilian law, not parade protocol. Would you say, Mr. Monroe, that you're more familiar with balancing bayonets than understanding legal nuance? His voice carried a smug twist now. Tell the court, do you have experience outside of standing in straight lines for tourists? The jab landed, or so he thought. Thomas didn't move. Not a blink, not a twitch. He stood as he had stood in Helmand, when silence meant survival, and stillness kept panic from spreading. Let the record show the witness is demonstrating ceremonial discipline, Leeds added dryly. Or perhaps he's just confused without a script. The judge didn't correct him. And in that moment, the courtroom felt colder than before. A boy in the gallery tugged on his grandfather's sleeve. The old man, a retired Royal Navy commander in a blazer thick with medals, leaned closer. "He's not standing still," he whispered, barely audible. "He's standing firm." The boy looked again, this time noticing the badge on Thomas's chest. A commendation most wouldn't recognize, unless they'd served. Leeds stepped closer. Or is this just royal cosplay? A well-fitted costume that gives you the illusion of rank? His hand waved vaguely, dismissively, as if brushing dust from the air. Truth is, your job's to decorate the palace stairs, not determine truth inside a courtroom. One of the jurors, a woman in her 60s with a sharp eye and a quiet past of her own, shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't even watching Leeds anymore. Her eyes stayed on the man who hadn't yet said a word. Silence stretched. There was no objection, no defense. Only the sound of weight pressing against years of earned discipline. The guard's gloved hands remained still, but his shoulders, square as always, seemed to carry something older than the room itself. A memory, perhaps, or a name. Leeds smirked, now emboldened by the lack of rebuttal. That's what I thought. Not a word. I suppose it's easier to hold a rifle for photos than to hold your own in testimony. His voice bit hard now, meant to provoke. But Thomas had known worse. He had stood in the dark when his radio went silent. He had waited for the sound of a bomb that didn't go off. He had buried friends whose names weren't carved into monuments. He had once dug a grave in a dry trench with a torn ration tin because the shovels never came. And in those moments, too, he had stood still. The courtroom may not have seen it, but it felt it. The dignity, the history, the refusal to be baited, to rise, to perform. He didn't even flinch, and that said everything. One woman in the back pressed her hand over her heart. A courtroom clerk paused mid-note. Even the judge's pen froze above the margin. Because sometimes what breaks a room isn't volume, it's restraint. And when mockery targets a symbol of sacrifice, what speaks louder? A clever retort, or a silence that makes grown men blink back something they hadn't planned to feel. Thomas inhaled, once. Deep. Steady. And in that moment, the sound of one man breathing became louder than the echoes of insult. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of the entire courtroom rested on Thomas Monroe's shoulders, and he bore it like he had in silence his whole life. But then, without warning or flourish, he moved. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just a measured step forward, as if adjusting his posture before speaking at a memorial. He didn't look at Daniel Leeds when he spoke. He looked straight ahead, at no one in particular, as though speaking not to the people in the courtroom, but to the ones who weren't there anymore. 2 tours, he said. The voice was calm, British, and unmistakably military. Helmand, Bosnia. 10 brothers buried. I don't stand here for spectacle. No one laughed now. The judge's gaze dropped to his own notes. Leeds opened his mouth to interrupt, but for the first time his timing failed him. The words didn't come, because the moment didn't belong to him anymore. Thomas slowly reached into the ceremonial folder resting on the stand beside him. With white-gloved precision, he retrieved a sealed document, aged parchment bearing the unmistakable wax and insignia of the late Queen Elizabeth II. He handed it wordlessly to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge with both hands, as if cradling something sacred. The courtroom watched in complete stillness. The judge unfolded it. There, in clear handwriting and signature, was a commendation for Thomas Monroe, awarded for courage and composure under direct fire during Operation Panther's Claw, mentioned in dispatches, commended by the Ministry of Defense, endorsed by Her Majesty. The kind of document that never makes headlines, but earns silence from those who served. The judge's expression changed, subtly at first. His brow furrowed, then softened. His lips parted, but no words came yet. Leeds tried to salvage it. Your Honor, if I may, this is character fluff, not relevant to the... Thomas turned his eyes to him. Just once. Measured. Unblinking. So is your mockery, he said quietly, but I stood for it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He didn't step closer. He simply spoke with the weight of sand, blood, discipline, and years. Not just for himself, but for the friends who never came home to speak at all. The room held its breath. Someone in the gallery sat down without realizing they had stood. A stenographer paused mid-stroke. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to hum quieter. The judge folded the commendation slowly and placed it beside his gavel. He looked up at Leeds, not with anger, but with something older, disappointment, clarity. "You will respect this man," he said evenly, "and you will respect this courtroom." No one clapped. No one dared, because the moment wasn't for performance. It was for truth. At the witness stand, Thomas didn't move again. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply resumed his posture, the way he had stood outside Windsor Castle, in sun and rain, in ceremony and silence. A royal guard had spoken, once, and it was enough. Leeds's voice cracked as he tried to form another objection, but the sound caught in his throat. There was nothing left to argue. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. It didn't belong to his ego or his theatrics or the cleverness he once weaponized so effortlessly. It belonged to something older than any of them, something earned, something unshakable, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for respect, but receives it anyway. He sank an inch lower in his stance, eyes avoiding the man he had spent the better part of an hour trying to dismantle. Thomas Monroe didn't move, not to acknowledge victory, not to invite pity, not even to register what had just passed between them. His hands remained calmly folded before him, his eyes level, his boots anchored to the floor like they'd grown from it. A long silence held the room in place, but it wasn't empty. It was full, weighted with things that no words could carry. It was the silence that sits after taps play at a soldier's funeral, the silence between a widow's hands as she folds the flag, the silence of dignity held when there's nothing left to prove. And then, from the back of the courtroom, a sound that did not break the silence, but deepened it. An elderly woman rose slowly, hands resting on a cane carved with decades of wear. Her voice didn't rise, yet somehow carried with perfect clarity. "My husband was Coldstream," she said, her eyes fixed on Thomas. He stood the same way, never flinched, never needed to. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Her words floated for a moment, then settled gently over the room like dust in stained glass light. There was no applause, no cheer, just reverence. A man 2 rows down wiped his eyes. Another, an off-duty officer by the cut of his coat, nodded silently, almost as if giving permission to feel what so many were holding back. Thomas didn't acknowledge the woman directly, but there was a stillness in his breath, a slight lowering of the shoulders that spoke in place of thanks. He didn't speak again, not because he had nothing more to say, but because everything had already been said. He didn't even flinch, and that said everything. The judge cleared his throat, but instead of delivering an official ruling, he simply looked around the room, took in the shift in posture, the softened expressions, the quiet reverence that had replaced mockery. "This court," he said carefully, "is dismissed with respect." It wasn't a legal conclusion. It was a moral one. People stood slowly, not in haste, not out of obligation, but because something sacred had just passed through that chamber, and standing felt like the only thing to do. No one looked at Leeds. No one needed to. He had already shrunk from sight, his presence receding beneath the weight of something he could never learn in a textbook. As the crowd began to file out, many glanced once more toward the man who had not raised his voice, not raised his hand, not even raised an eyebrow, but had, somehow, raised the entire room. He didn't move, but the world did. Weeks passed. The courtroom echoed no more. Its walls, once complicit in a shallow laugh, now remembered something heavier than a ruling, an unshakable presence that never once had to raise its voice. Quietly, with no press release, Daniel Leeds mailed a folded letter to the Coldstream Barracks. Not typed, written by hand. The ink carried apology, The signature carried humility. It wasn't read aloud. It didn't need to be. It arrived, was opened and filed beneath correspondence, where the regiment keeps things that matter but don't boast. Thomas Monroe's reassignment came with no ceremony, no dismissal, only a salute from his superior and a quiet nod toward a new posting, the Royal Remembrance Service. It was not a punishment. It was a trust. A Coldstream Guard, once mocked in court, now entrusted with escorting the nameless fallen, those without medals, without family, but never without dignity. He began walking alongside caskets again, not in sand, but on British soil. His uniform remained the same, though the silence around him felt deeper now, as if others could hear what he had learned long ago. On a rainy morning near Westminster Abbey, after a wreath was laid for a corporal whose name barely made the rolls, a young cadet approached him beneath the arch. Barely 20, sharp, curious, eager. "Did you ever want to respond with more?" the boy asked, eyes locked on Thomas's face. The veteran looked down, not at him, but through time. "No," he said evenly, "because silence holds more truth than a raised voice ever could." The boy nodded. He didn't fully understand, but he would. Back in London, the courtroom was just another space again. The benches scrubbed, the walls repainted, but the silence lingered. Beneath the judge's bench, tucked in a crevice few noticed, rested a card. No seal, just words in pen, to the man who never moved, but moved us all. That was the final word, and no one dared follow it. This was a Royal Guard's silence, not a void, but a verdict, and it was heard everywhere. Some uniforms are sewn with fabric, others are stitched with sacrifice. Today, inside a London courtroom, a Coldstream Guard named Thomas Monroe reminded us that dignity doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence that outlasts the noise. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push back. He simply stood, revealed what no one had asked, and in doing so, turned a moment of mockery into a lesson that stayed behind long after the room emptied. So let's take this moment together. Why does it take disrespect for some to recognize what's always been sacred? Why must a soldier's silence be broken before it's finally heard? If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in honor. Must share your thoughts below. We love to listen back from you. Don't forget to subscribe and press notification button so you will never miss our next video, where the truth doesn't yell. It stands tall.